Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the War Report with some news that did catch, I would at least say, me by surprise in regard to what happened between Iran and the U.S. vis-a-vis Iraq and how this conflict isn't necessarily spreading to the Middle East but is affecting geopolitics and negotiations in the Middle East, whether that be with the Gulf states, whether that be with the JCPOA. I do think there are some items worth exploring there. Now, of course, for the past few weeks, we have speculated. We're in about day 22 of the invasion. We have speculated on how this is going to have global ripple effects, and we'll get into some of the news with Russia and China later as well. But just discussing with the Middle East in general. So, on Saturday night, at least Eastern Seaboard time, there were missile strikes on a U.S. consulate in Irbil, Iraq. Now, that is in the heart of the Kurdish controlled regions of Iraq. Many claimed it was an embassy, many claimed it was a U.S. military base, but it was the consulate in Irbil, Iraq. Now, this is, of course, during the revival of negotiations with Iran regarding the JCPOA and nuclear talks, and those, of course, were in wake of the more recent Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, we were discussing last week how Iran had become something of a kingmaker when it comes to the global energy market and supplying the West with oil and gas because of the attempts to isolate Russia from the energy market, which we will get more into Russian European relations, particularly some comments made by the German government regarding the sanctions and energy trade with Russia later in the show. But it does remind me almost as an inverse of Biden's strikes on Iranian groups operating in
Mm,
Syria around February of last year, late February of last year, right before U.S. negotiators were supposed to meet with Iranians regarding the nuclear deal. Now, this doesn't surprise me. Of course, the conspiracies and speculations and the usual chatter spread that did Russia put them up to this? Is this some sort of coordinated attack? Is Taiwan next? All the normal speculation that goes on when you see these sort of things. Now,
yeah.
this was never followed up by another Iranian action, nor was it met with U.S. retaliation. It was more or less just swept under the rug. And you can tell, and we'll get into some of this news with Ukraine as well, when strikes are not addressed, when they are swept under the rug, that's usually because they were impactful.
Yeah.
When they are
Mhm.
blown out of proportion, when they become front page news, it's usually to drum up the narrative. But when they don't get talked about, when it almost seems as if those stories get actively suppressed, it's because it's not something they want to address, which implies it is more serious. You do see this, I would say Israel is a prime example of this, where any Palestinian bottle rocket attack will be front page news for a week and a half. But when you actually had, I believe it was in summer 2019, when Hezbollah shot rockets into northern Israel up against those military vehicles, they first brushed it off and then claimed that Hezbollah had actually attacked decoys and that those were either inflatable vehicles or they were dummy drone controlled vehicles to try to draw out their fire. Just these things to really obfuscate blame from the fact that they actually did the significant strike. And time
Yeah.
again, you see that when countries downplay these things, it is usually because they're more serious and they aren't willing to fully commit to the action that would be required to deal with something that is more serious beyond the usual hand wringing and complaining that you see, for example, again, with Palestinian bottle rockets or any other equivalent situation.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we should remember, or we should bring up rather, that about a week or about 5 days before this attack, Israel had bombed, after a kind of regained pace of bombing Syria. and it had killed in the process, I believe, a civilian, including a child, but it also killed two Iranian officers. Another day, I believe it had killed also two Syrian Arab Army soldiers. And the pace has picked up. There have been at least 8 or 9 deaths in central Syria. So of Syrian soldiers. Like you, I was shocked when you see the videos. These are very precise hits. Uh, it's important, as you mentioned. Um, the more quiet they are, the more likely when they say that they hit a Mossad essentially base centered in Kurdistan in the Kurdish region of Iraq, because the Israelis work very very closely with the Kurds, particularly the ones in Iraq, but they have worked with those in Syria as well. And what they've said, Iran, that is, after about a day or two, they admitted that it was a certain group, uh, Iran linked, Iran aligned within Iraq. I saw some controversy about that, to be honest. But Iran essentially takes responsibility for it. They're not sorry. And they're saying that four uh, Mossad agents have been killed. And I don't hear, I mean, I could, there's a war going on in Ukraine that's consuming almost all my attention, but I didn't hear any refutations to that. Everybody did not in the West in Israel did not want to talk about this.
Yes, and there
It's
was
almost like it
footage
didn't
coming
happen.
out of the Iranian parts of what they call Iranian Azerbaijan, which is the Azeri region in Iran where these missile strikes came from. And they were much too precise to have been any of these proxy groups, such as the Popular Mobilization Units, Iraqi Hezbollah, or
Yeah,
any of these
great
other
point.
Iranian aligned militias or otherwise anti American occupation militias could not have pulled off a strike of this caliber and of this precision.
No way. And I think they fired nine. I mean, some of these groups have like literally one or two. They shoot them off, and then they wait for another week or two to get another one. Like these were nine in a very short period of time, in just minutes. You're right. That cannot be just some insurgency group.
And with that, we will see how that affects the negotiations, considering the fact it wasn't acknowledged, at least publicly. I imagine the backdoor negotiations that we all know happen but have very little detail about have certainly addressed this. And again, Iran is in the position of a kingmaker. They can afford to do something like that. And this isn't even a Trump versus Biden thing, but if this would have happened just under the geopolitical situation of 2019 or even 2020, there would have been another heat up,
Yeah.
another standoff. Maybe we wouldn't have struck Iran in retaliation, but there would have been the constant talks about it. We probably would have hit some Iranian backed militia group as retaliation or hit somewhere in Syria as retaliation. But it would have been a mess of saber rattling, and it didn't even escalate to that point this time, which you can tell either A, it was very serious and they didn't want to address it, B, it played well to the Iranian negotiating strategy and really shows how much of an advantageous position they are currently in, or what's most likely is C, that both are true. And that's not the only news out of the Middle East when it comes to waning American influence. In fact, an arguable siege on American influence in the region, because you have this battle to court both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, as well as the other Gulf states, but in particular, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are being courted by China, while the U.S. is grappling to maintain their previous position of near indisputable influence over those states. Now, we have been talking for the past 3 weeks since the start of the invasion how negotiations for the petro yuan had been in progress, and that we are effectively looking at in the near future the death of the petrodollar by my estimations. I won't put an exact time frame on that, but unless there's some major shift in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states soon, orchestrated by, again, CIA, MI6, any of these, Mossad, any of these organizations that are aligned with the American empire, the current leadership is going to continue down the path of working closer with China and working closer with non-American partners, as we've seen for the past several years. But again, ever since the beginning of this crisis, that has accelerated beyond any level I could have imagined. This is something I would have thought it would have taken years to reach, but I suppose it just took one cataclysmic event in order to kick this off, in order to really call the bluff the American empire, get egg on their face. And like I said, I'm not ruling out some sort of behind the scenes operations where we either threaten the Gulf states into compliance or work behind the scenes with political rivals in order to either pressure or dislodge the current leadership of said Gulf states. But on the current trajectory, assuming the American empire is still floundering the same way it is and doesn't have a cohesive response, or worse yet, has a failed response, we are within the next course of the next few years looking at the effective death of the petrodollar. I will reiterate that point again and again.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, every one of these countries that we've been looking at the last week or last 2 weeks now, or just, getting around there 10 days, 11 days, you look at Venezuela and they're not willing to, sorry, very noisy out here, fall with the US. Qatar and Saudi Arabia are still resolute. They have not increased production. From what I understand, a friend of mine who I spoke with, at least in America and Canada, prices are artificially going down. You could also conversely argue that they're high what's based on speculation or feigned speculation. The real trouble, the real disaster is in Europe and particularly Germany. However, all these countries aren't budging, and you see India has agreed to a rupee ruble exchange. That will include oil as well. This is an enormous amount. Uh, the idea is also floated, I think, with China. And there's also discussion that eventually Russia will tell Europe, like, you, if you want our oil and gas, ruble. That may be the next salvo. That may be the next step that Russia takes, because it's begun to take certain steps. And yeah, but before I diverge too far into Russia, all to say that Iran can mess up the JPCOA deal whenever it feels like it. It is absolutely playing with that. There is no question that them uh, launching these missiles, essentially, what they're saying is they're laughing at the U.S.
Yes, and again, it shows what the change in leadership really does, because as you recall, it was Rouhani who had lost the election last year and stepped down in favor of Raisi, who has now come to office, who is not a hardliner, but much more hardline than Rouhani, who was considered by many a moderate, which is the reason why the JCPOA was speculated to have even been agreed to in the first place. And now that is gone, that is out of the water. Rouhani was a very, even up until the end, even up until he was forced to leave office, a very conciliatory figure when it came to negotiations with all the U.S. presidents that he dealt with, whether that was Obama, whether that was Trump, whether that was even in his last year, Biden. And now it's become a much more fickle situation. I do think, especially after the death of Soleimani. And somebody did point out that looking at the time of the strike, it was the exact time of day in which the strikes that took out Soleimani
Oh, wow.
took place. Now, chalk that up to what you will. That time, I believe it was around 4 a.m. in Iraq and Iran. That time is just very common for these military operations to take place. You recall when the U.S. struck Syria both times, it was around the 4 a.m. hour in both 2017 and 2018 when the missiles were launched at Syria. So you could chalk that up to some sort of symbolic thing. You could chalk that up just to that's when these operations take place. They're usually night raids, but either way, that's still these strikes are still an interesting tie-in to the Soleimani assassination. How, despite the fact that it did set Iran back, despite the fact that they did lose one of their best strategic minds, I don't think it crippled them in the way that a lot of the people within the American empire were expecting Iran to be crippled. Now you recall this was in the first few days of the year of 2020, which was just about 6 weeks before, of course, the new narrative of the lockdowns and the COVID took over from March 2020 onward. And that really ran with it, that really stole the show. That really slowed down a lot of geopolitical news, even out of some of the hottest spots in the world. And maybe these are just signs that things are returning back to a so-called normal, where the tensions of these conflicts are picking up. Now, I will once again reiterate talking about the Iranian issue. Ever since the summer of 2019, when Trump, either by good judgment or by circumstance, refused to take the U.S. to war with Iran, that was the last real opportunity for an American-Iranian war in the foreseeable future to have taken place, and now that chapter is closed. I maintained if Trump stayed in office, Iran would become a nuclear power and they would revert to something of a North Korea status. In fact, may actually get negotiations by being a nuclear power, could actually leverage that. It does seem like ever since Biden came into office, of course, being Obama's vice president and being one of the people who was in the American administration when the JCPOA was originally agreed to, that influenced that later, but it's more so, as you can see, the American empire needs to sway Iran more than Iran needs to be courted by the American empire with the JCPOA, because their economic situation, their integration with non-Western economies has very much improved. And although they would like access to those European energy markets and those Western energy markets, it isn't a matter of survival for them. They can weather it. They have weathered it for 40 years, but they are in a position where they can actually crack that open, but it isn't vital. Whereas in 2015, there was much more pressure on the Iranian leadership in order to reach some sort of understanding with the West due to their current economic situation. However, once again, with the rise of Russia and China as a separate pole, as it were, Iran has fared much better in the past 4 years.
I think if we look in retrospect, everything that is happening now, because so much of what is happening seems all at once. And uh, it's clear now that this could probably not have been successful 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. But you can surmise all the various meetings and machinations that took place. These powers have cemented their agreements and really are forging an alternative to, U.S. hegemony. I think there's no question about it. Again, we'll get into it, but Putin's speech said that they're not printing any more bills, sanctions. That's a very strong sign, and the ruble has climbed up nearly to where it was before the invasion. So it looks like, China leading the way has developed, um, or is in the process of developing, a new system.
Yes. And the way it has been, once again, to dispel a lot of the notion, I do think people are coming around to the idea that Russia and China's relationship goes further than just friends of convenience. Now, I do believe that's a large part of that, but they've also found a lot of common ground in this relationship of that may have started out as a friendship of convenience. So there's not going to be much that can break that. I don't think there's really any sweetheart deal that Blinken can take either to Beijing or Moscow to pull one away from the other, as, say, Kissinger did
No,
to China in the 70s. I simply don't see anything like that happening. And I do maintain that, and again, it would have to be the sweetest deal in the world for either of them. It would require major concessions, which would further weaken the American empire to the point where, insofar as the people who run the empire are concerned, it's more palatable to take on a two front Cold War against both Russia and China at that point. And I do believe we will see that path continue, considering the fact that the time for any negotiations was at least during the Trump era at the latest, let's just put it that way. But
yeah,
far before that, if not. Trump was, as reviled as he was and as controversial as he was, both at home and abroad, he was the last chance for a lot of things. He was the last chance for a lot of agreements, both at home and abroad, because love or hate the man, again, he's Mr. Art of the Deal. He's the negotiator. Now, whatever you think of his track record as a negotiator, whether that be in the eh, private sector or in his role as president, that's whatever. But point being is, he's the guy who, at least on the surface of things, is willing to make a deal. And once that has gone out the window, there, I don't think we'll ever have a U.S. president, for better or for worse, like Trump in that regard, who has a foreign policy like Trump's, where it does seem very malleable regardless of who you are. Because, of course, we have said Biden's foreign policy has followed much the same schizophrenia as the Trump administration, but the Trump administration left more windows of opportunity, I believe, for everyone open. And again, this isn't some singing of Trump's praises. If it comes off that way, it's not meant to. But he left a lot more windows of opportunity open. For example, think the Helsinki summit, think his constant meetings with Xi Jinping, think his North Korea summits, where it was a very flash in the pan moment to secure a deal that would have been agreed to under no other American administration, even if it would have been undone by the next one, as Biden has undone a lot of what Trump has done, both at home and abroad, as these things usually tend to work out. But with that being said, I do think the world is coming to an understanding that that is simply how the American empire works, that in a post-Trump era, after taking that embarrassment both on the home front and on the international stage, that they are going to be a much less compromising power. And that does bring us into some news about Europe, as I would say, out of anywhere in the world, they bear the brunt of that American empire's stubbornness the most out of anyone. Now,
yeah,
you had on the periphery of Europe, of course, not actually Europe, but to really bridge the gap between Europe and the Middle East, Turkey, once again, has come out and pivoted once again. Now, after they have had these conciliatory talks with Russia and this agreement to a what many would have called a pro-Russian neutrality, where they weren't going to let any ships into the Black Sea, and I do believe they maintain that policy, whether they be Russian or NATO. They have also said that they would like to be the guarantor of Ukraine's security, and this, of course, upon the arrival of Turkish nationals who were evacuated from the Ukraine. So, how much of this was just a grandstanding statement, or maybe my joke about Erdogan wanting to reestablish the Crimean Khanate is actually coming true before our very eyes? Now, I wouldn't go that far, But point being is he is pivoting again. This is to be expected of Erdogan. This is to be expected of Turkey over the past several years, where he is now playing the pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO side to keep in their good graces. But you give it a couple weeks, he'll be once again conciliatory towards Moscow, and it will just swing back and forth. The Turkish pendulum will swing back and forth as it always does. And again, you were pointing out, we were talking before the show, that this is the man who just 6 months ago was on the ropes and was staring down a possible removal from power, whether that be by civil means or non civil means, and that his economy was in shambles, that it was enduring American sanctions. But it does look like, despite his monetary policy, despite his crisis with inflation, I suppose it's a global theme at this point, he has managed to weather this storm and is back to the relatively stable position he had now, where he certainly isn't a widely beloved figure in Turkey, but he's also not reviled, so he's able to do quite a bit of what he wants, both at home and abroad. And it looks like he is, once again, trying to stay in the good graces of both sides of this conflict, which should surprise no one, as is another Middle Eastern country, Israel. And we'll get into some of the comments Bennett had made, as we did last week, and his advice to Zelensky, and Zelensky's accosting of Israel for not doing more for their Jewish brother, as he would have put it. But with that being said, again, I doubt we're going to see the Janissaries fighting against the Russians in Mariupol. If you're picking up what I'm putting down.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. I think the most significant move that Erdogan did right at the beginning of the war was that he said there would be no more ships going, no more military ships going in and out of the Bosphorus. And now, of course, obviously, armaments are still going, disguised as humanitarian relief, or strewn in amongst humanitarian relief. But that is keeping what could be a flotilla of particularly American and British warships that could conceivably start something. I don't know. I mean, there is a lot of talk, the longer that this war takes, that America and NATO will eventually intervene, but the emphasis has been, no, we're not going to start World War III, no matter how emphatically they say, close the sky. So it's still, because I think when the war started, it took me about a half an hour to realize, what is going to happen with the Bosphorus? Are we going to see a naval battle? And I think Erdogan shutting it down to military was a big help to Russia. I think he's probably doing it because, I mean, it's not, the issue isn't solved, but I think he wants a chunk out of Syria. And that would be my guess. Or he wants a bigger role in Central Asia, economically speaking.
Yes, and again, you could also look at it from the perspective of self-preservation, where he doesn't want warships battling over the Bosphorus. That is, again, technically within his territory, and that it would wreak havoc on the already fragile Turkish economy to bring a war to Turkish shores, even if they aren't directly involved in it. So, just from a simple act of self-preservation, he's not going to allow this unless he is putting his hat down on one side or the other. But also, this is valuable to extract concessions. He could threaten Russia to allow NATO ships into the Black Sea if there isn't, say, a concession in Syria or Central Asia or Azerbaijan or wherever else Turkey has been involved. Or, hell, maybe even Libya, because the Libya conflict has followed its normal cycle where it has gone dark yet again for several months, if not multiple years at a time, where we'll get more or less a news blackout out of the conflict in Libya, which has more or less come to a stalemate. It hasn't really had any major breakthroughs until since the summer of 2020, but we could witness certainly a much larger extraction of concessions out of either Russia or the West vis-a-vis Turkey. Now, just because, as we were saying earlier, I doubt the Turks, I doubt Erdogan wants to see a naval battle in or near his waters. I imagine the negotiations will be aimed much more towards Russia than allowing NATO ships into the Black Sea unless he is fully in on a NATO intervention or a soft intervention into Ukraine. Because, again, there's much more he can extract out of Russia where he's putting himself firmly down on the NATO side if he does allow NATO ships in there, where there will be very little left to bargain with when it comes to his relationship with Russia if he does allow NATO ships into the Black Sea. So we are witnessing the wild card come back. He's reclaiming that title from Orban yet again. They're always in a neck and neck race for it, but Erdogan always seems to win out in the end. But with that being said, speaking of Orban, now he's sitting this one out, but several Central European leaders, namely the Prime Ministers of Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia, have resolved that they're going to meet with Zelensky in Kiev while it's under siege. And we all know what this is trying to accomplish. We all know why they're going there. So they could say Russia is attacking a capital while there's an official diplomatic visit of heads of state of NATO countries.
Yeah.
That's the real goal, as we all know. Now, will this actually happen? There's speculation where this summit will happen, but in a NATO country, whether that be Poland or the Czech Republic. And it's been something they've been threatening to do for the past 2 days now. I frankly don't see it happen. I think it's a lot of hot air, but I do think it also shows a certain level of NATO desperation. Trust me, we'll have plenty in the way of desperation when we get into some of this news about Zelensky and his little world tour lately. But you have NATO in this position, which shouldn't surprise anyone, but especially over the past 3 weeks, where it is seemingly all bark and no bite, to the point where they will condemn Russia, they will say we need to do more to support Ukraine, they will go the whole 9 yards with that. And not that I support this, but the minute a no-fly zone is mentioned, it's completely shut down, even by the biggest of hawks within the United States. I mean, sure, you have a few senators here and there saying, well, of course the no-fly zone is a good idea, but the American administration has shot that down, NATO leadership has shot that down, most NATO countries have shot that down. Pretty much the only country that has agreed to it is Latvia, which we all know the striking size of the Latvian Air Force in order to not only establish air superiority over Ukraine, but then also enforce a no-fly zone. And I will say once again, the Pentagon officials who testified before Congress in 2015 when it came to intervention in Syria said that a no-fly zone without a confrontation with Russia was impossible. And I will say once again, if they weren't willing to risk that for Syria, which would have been the first opportunity to really hit back against a rising Russia, they're not going to risk it over Ukraine by any means. A country that, again, is not even a NATO member, despite Zelensky's, I would say, deepest and darkest desires. But with that being said, there is a lot of war fervor within the West, within the heart of the American empire in particular. As we saw with Zelensky's speech in front of Congress, of course, he invokes Pearl Harbor and 9/11, trying to, which does imply something interesting if you know some basic history about those two events.
And Martin Luther King.
Oh
I
yes,
have a dream.
how could we forget the great invocations of all the great figures of the civic religion? And I guess he is very well versed in the civic religion, or his speechwriters are. So I'll give them that much. It's one of the more compelling things when you're talking to the heart of the American empire. He did get them all to unanimously denounce Putin as a war criminal, as a Senate resolution did pass unanimously. So I guess we're gonna bring Putler to justice. I guess he'll be in The Hague in any day now. So that's the way it's really going to go. But with that being said, despite all this fervor you also have, and I'm certainly not complaining, a great hesitancy towards any real action that would back up that fervor, which means either A, it's going to fizzle out, or B, they're going to need some sort of substantial action, maybe not even a no-fly zone, but some sort of substantial action to actually back up these people who are frothing at the mouth for a confrontation with Russia over Ukraine. So one or the other has to give. That's not only in the United States, but in other Western countries and other NATO countries as well. Either this is going to fizzle out over the next few weeks, this fervor, or they're going to do something to justify that fervor, which I think the former is much more likely. And again, you just have this ongoing, and you have Zelensky just making the rounds, kissing all the right rings, and really appealing to the great figures of our civic religion and of our beliefs, really tugging on the heartstrings of every good citizen of the American Empire, which I suppose that makes us very bad citizens of the American Empire, considering the fact that we aren't touched by this speech at all. And again, several, I believe it was a total of, it was some ridiculous amount of standing ovations. I think it rivaled what would have been
Yeah.
a Netanyahu speech. And yes, and this was, of course, all the same speech. He accused Israel of not doing enough for, again, a fellow Jew, which I do think is a you know, narrative-wise, I think that was probably a very dumb thing to say, but I was entertained nonetheless. And of course, this
You're
follows.
giving it away.
Yes, this follows
Stop
Bennett's
naming them.
recommendation that it's time to throw up the white flag. It's time to reach negotiations. Now, insofar as that
Yeah.
is concerned, I do believe, and I've heard this theory tossed around, and it's plausible. I won't fully co-sign it, but it's plausible that Zelensky is waiting for a lot of these more hardline groups, a lot of these groups that were associated with what would have formerly been called the Pravi sector at the beginning of the Maidan. He's waiting for them to all go through the meat grinder as the Russian advance continues through places like Mariupol and through the rest of eastern Ukraine before he actually makes serious strides towards peace negotiations. Because I do believe there's a genuine possibility, not a great possibility, that either by civic means such as an impeachment or recall election, some legitimate means, or through more forceful means, that he will be removed from office if he does try to pursue peace negotiations while certain political figures and certain political sentiments are still in the air.
Yeah, I mean, I think as you pointed out earlier, um, it's a done deal. We are going back to the world that we had prior to 1991, and as we've been saying for quite a long time, long before people were paying attention to the Russian buildup on the borders, that the U.S. is moving towards a consolidation of power, and I think that's what we're seeing here as well. Um, for them to say, Putin is a war criminal, ostensibly means like we're never going to have any kind of diplomatic relations with the Russians for decades, and that's how it's going to go. And it's also a clear sign to the rest of the EU and NATO not to do as well. Um, Putin's speech essentially says that we're done. It's over. We are done with the West. Ostensibly, we're done with the empire of lies, and we have to forge a completely different path. Um, that's where we are now. China, in many ways, is going to be this both economic, financial, and even diplomatic link between Russia and the West. going forward. Um, Other countries might be brought into it, or like Iran, but there are a lot. India is another one. So is Saudi Arabia. I mean, Qatar visited Russia yesterday. Their president flew to Moscow. So yes, it's a consolidation, but it's not. The net hasn't grabbed as many countries as we might think.
Yes, and you can actually look at the map of sanctions and actions against Russia. It is the U.S., EU, and NATO countries, Japan, and Australia. Those are the countries that have gone along with this, and it because you show the map of the world and most of it's missing. Now, I'm not saying that the states of Latin America, Africa, and Asia, these smaller statelets, have this overwhelming influence. Of course, they are small countries, but again, we're talking about major countries like China, like India, Iran, um, and again, even some of these more secondary nations like Saudi Arabia, like the Gulf states, like Egypt, where sure they're not the most influential in the world, but these are very pivotal countries, whether that be for geographic reasons or economic reasons or whatever they produce. And with that being said, it still is very isolating. And there was a video put out by Chinese state media that more or less said that U.S. sanctions. I'm trying to remember the exact way they described it, but U.S. sanctions were like an arrow that is on a downward trajectory the further it fires. And
Mhm,
getting at the
mhm,
idea of what we've been talking about for quite some, really touching on the ideas of diminishing returns that we have discussed on this program several times throughout the past 4 years. And with all of that being said, with what we're looking at, again, take Chinese state media how you will, but I do think it was a good point, regardless of who it came from. The idea that these American sanctions are only going to go so far, and you even have very loyal countries to the empire, like Germany, coming out and saying, we simply cannot bear putting energy sanctions on Russia because of our current economic situation, because of our current needs. And as you mentioned earlier in the show, it's Europe who is really going to feel this pain. And they are the ones who are going to be at the forefront of this crusade against Russia, so to speak. And the $1 million question yet again comes up: how much pain will the American empire tolerate for Europe?
mhm, mhm.
Or how much pain will Europe tolerate for the American empire, excuse me.
Right. But where is Europe supposed to go? Um,
Exactly.
I mean, it was going towards China, and that of this whole conflict is to stop uh, Europe going to China. Essentially, America is fully aware that China is going to back Russia, which will give America basically the moral high ground to condemn China, and therefore Europe will not be able to make the kind of deals that it has in the past. So I don't believe it will punish China to the same level that it has punished or attempted to punish um, Russia, but yeah, here we are. I think that was the basic strategy. I mean, I do think, just to give America credit, I think they know very well that the a significant portion of the world is ready to move beyond the American dollar, and there are lots of steps taking place now. Some things are done basically just to get a feel of what America will and won't do, right? Um, but it seems like Saudi Arabia at first was maybe prodding just to see what America will do. But I think they will go ahead and at least oil in the yuan, and this will have tremendous effects. I mean, just to bring the topic back to the German economy. If you read some of the latest articles, It's being gutted right now. And again, I said it a long time ago, I would think they want it to. My guess is they're going to financialize the economy, and there won't be much of an industry at all in Europe or in Germany. And in some ways, again, manufacturers in Asia, they would include, uh, China to some degree. I don't see tremendous efforts by the U.S. Like under the Trump administration. They brought over a Samsung semiconductor plant. They're building another one of those, and they're building money. So I don't want to poo the whole thing, but it is going to get very expensive for Germany's other industries. And then we've already spoken about how Poland is tied into the Germany's industry, particularly its automotive industry. And so this is going to be, I think, the most interesting year in decades, as if the last two haven't been interesting.
Oh, certainly. And once again, it just seems to accelerate now. I said previously that 2019 was one of the most pivotal years. That was outshined by 2020, then by 2021. And it seems like 2022 is on the record to be one of the most pivotal years in modern history in terms of undoing much of the post-war order. And I do believe that we are seeing the largest geopolitical shifts since, again, 1919. I'll say even beyond 1945, we're seeing the biggest shifts since 1919. A real loss in confidence of this idea of a united world or a liberal world order where we're all supposed to sit down and cooperate, and again, such as forms such as the UN. And I'm not saying it's going to happen anytime soon, certainly not, but a future where the UN, I mean, the UN is already a toothless body, but a future where the UN is effectively disbanded is not out of the realm of possibility. I mean, just look at what we have now, where they try to raise a UN resolution against Russia, but of course it's impossible to pass because Russia itself has a veto power, China itself has a veto power. This idea of a form of nations and that sovereignty relies on membership of this body. I mean, like we said, the UN is already a toothless beast, but as the American Empire wanes, and of course it is a tool of the American Empire, but as the American Empire wanes, so too will the significance of an organization such as the United Nations. And I, for one, will welcome the day when the charade is put to an end, when we can stop pretending like this body has any influence or any significance. I don't think that will be that'll probably be a few decades from now. But again, I hate to put time frames on things the way things have accelerated in the past, but it does call into question every post-war institution, every post-war agreement made by the nascent American empire into the modern-day American empire, and it's pivotal. I think a lot of people, I mean, virtually nobody alive has grown up in a world today where the American empire wasn't the preeminent power of the world. Of course, you did have the Cold War, you did have the Soviet Union, but at the end of the day, the Soviet Union was just a particularly powerful challenger to what was eventually going to be a hegemonic power. It was just 50 years of roadblocks. Not that I'm not saying the Soviet Union was completely insignificant, but there's a reason why the American Empire won the Cold War over them.
Mhm. You know, while we're on the topic of Russia, I have to mention that I did see an interesting video, and I suppose I knew it was coming, but you know, uh, way back in 2014, or let's say 2013, as people know that I'm a bit of a Spengler fan. I was reading it, beginning to understand it, and then the war broke out in Ukraine, and I looked at like the resolve of the people in Donbass as a sign that not only that it would bring a greater conflict, but also that that there was a portion, particularly in Russia, that cannot accept the West. That on some deep socio-psychological level, they do not identify with it, right? And then I discovered John David Ebert, and John David Ebert. It's an old video from 2012, but you can see his entire reading and analysis of volumes 1 and 2 of The Decline of the West and the 1922 essay on Russia that he did. But he had a very interesting video, and I want to sort of combine what he said with some of the things I wasn't able to say, or I had forgotten rather, the last episode that we did, and that is this curious story of some of the Russian soldiers who have been captured with them on their persons, a kind of a letter, and it said several things. For instance, simple things like it gave it the symbolism of the flag, what each color stands for. But then it got into something, a bit more serious and esoteric, practical as well. I'll get to that later. But it said, Russia remains the last country against a emanating from the West. The practical part is it said to its soldiers that try to understand that some of your officers are not ethnic Russians, but you must still obey them because they and their forefathers also laid down their lives for Russia, for this fatherland, and remember to obey them. An interesting thing to say, especially because of the kind of the aspect of a brother war, a real brother war, much more so than, say, the French versus the German. Of course, it could also mean Shoigu, but if something should happen to Putin, Shoigu in many ways would be in charge of this. But that's sort of veering off. I would like to say, though, that John David Ebert did. He mentioned that the completion in 2020 highly symbolic of a kind of reinstatement of Russian identity, and many of the materials that are used were used from artifacts left over from World War II and what the Russians called the Great Patriotic War. Even the amount of steps. There's all kinds of symbolism if you read about it. Everything there is saturated with meaning, particularly dealing with World War II. And he considers what Putin is doing right now is a kind of a zone demarcation effort. In the same way that the Franks, who kicked out the Romans in Gaul, had to do that to their fellow Germanics in Spain, who were the Visigoths, and then later with the various the caliphates. I think it was the I'm probably butchering the name, but so a similar kind of demarcation is taking place. That is to settle what the boundaries are. This is particularly important in the first instance of a culture, right? The Franks, in many ways, were the leaders, the creators of what we call the West, leading up all the way to Pippin and Charlemagne. That whole transition from Merovingian to Carolingian, and then of course the kings like Otto the Great, which was Otto the First, and then Otto the Second, Otto the Third. And I saw one person post that because of course there's a 1,000 year gap between the West and um, let's say the Russian Slavic civilization. So what basically happened with Peter the Great would correspond with Charlemagne. Uh, the Russian Revolution itself, it was a crisis in many ways, but it used Western cultural forms against the West itself. In a similar way that turned the city down as a kind of um, spite to Napoleon when he reached Moscow, as much as it was a practical concern. So Putin would basically correspond to someone like Otto the First, possibly Otto the Second, or Otto the Third. Otto the First actually had a decisive war against the Hungarians. That's the eastern side of Germany for centuries, or for the Holy Roman Empire. So his argument, it kind of makes sense now. Literally kind of religious proclamations that are going to determine the course of Russia. Russia is going to close itself from the West. It is setting boundaries. It has created a military cathedral in the grand tradition of the kind of cathedrals that Russia is known for building, that have developed over that of what they absorbed from the Greek Orthodox style, right? So I thought that was a very to go check it out. John on YouTube, very, very interesting. Um, Anyhow, but even if that weren't the case, one still has to find all of this definition of these pamphlets that are with them, essentially saying things like, um, I'm I will die probably unremembered. Like, this is very serious stuff. I'm fighting the forces of Satan. Um, I think I do think Russia was prepared that America would, use every, like, this is America's most important project that they've ever had by far. And this would have been a project that even Britain would have wanted. And even though they controlled Crimea at two different points, they were not successful. So I think that the kind of reaction this would have was factored into what Russia is doing now. Progress is steady. There are losses, there's no question. I've seen video after video, and the Ghost of Kiev, and which is of course a joke. And the other claim by the Ukrainians that the Russians have already lost 12,000 men, which is it's ridiculous. It's even more than what they lost in Afghanistan, and we know now that American figures for Russian or Soviet losses in Afghanistan were highly exaggerated. But all of these things, are sort of par for the course.
And you are seeing
And
in
that,
that regard the newest Ukrainian propaganda push that this is really the last thing they're reliant on, where they have managed to garner sympathy throughout the vast majority of the West. I think something upwards of 80% of Americans have some sympathy for the Ukrainian plight, and of course, every corporation, every government official, every institution you can think of is on the "we must support Ukraine" train, and it has been even people who don't necessarily care about these sort of things, at least have some passive support of Ukraine. So they have managed to really rile up the pro Ukraine sentiments. They've really managed to generate a lot of sympathy in the West. Now, again, will that translate to any actual action, as we were discussing, with a lot of the fervor that has been raised, especially among Western politicians? I doubt it, but again, you can tell that they're really trying to drum something up in hopes that it will result in something of a, let's just say, pushback against Russia, and that Ukraine's really the last arrows it have in its quiver are all media and propaganda related. Not to downplay those two weapons, but they are on the ropes insofar as that's concerned. And you'll notice after that strike against the training
Yeah,
base in Lvov with the
yeah,
Russian missile strike against it, that was another instance where they were very quiet. You would have expected them to raise hell about it. Now, there were some speculations that there were British special forces at that base, there were American special forces, whatever. But point being is,
they most definitely were there. They most definitely were.
yes, and you can tell by once again their silence, because if it would have just been a base of the r/volunteers for Ukraine, they would have raised a ruckus. They would have said this is a war crime. I can't believe they struck this base, and this is just a show of Russian barbarity. Now there was a little bit of that, but that quickly dissipated in the face of complete radio silence, which once again would lead one to believe that they actually hit something pretty significant if they have shut up about it, much like the situation with Iran, where when they actually hit them where it hurts, they are rather quiet about it because it's not something they want to address without actually having the means to take substantial action. And once again, I don't think you're going to rile
Yes.
the American public even into some sort of limited engagement war, because much of the sympathy for Ukraine would sooner be eclipsed by that American gut instinct of isolationism. And we've discussed this before, where you have to, in order to generate real war fervor in the United States, make it personal to them. Hence the reason why something like Pearl Harbor worked. Hence the reason why the
Mhm.
German policy towards American ships in World War One worked. Hence the reason why September 11th worked. It was the idea, or at least the perception, that American lives are being lost at the hands of a foreign entity that really drums them up in the war. So unless they can pull off some convincing way or some convincing false flag that Russia is really responsible for X, Y, or Z, despite all the boisterousness, despite everything, the American instinct of isolationism will still be the dominant force, regardless of whatever rhetoric you put out there.
Right. It's an example where, you just lost, you won the meme war, but you lost the ground war. That event was absolutely shocking because who would have expected that Russia would have sent, some are saying 24, 30 cruise missiles to target this area? It was devastated. Only 10 to 15 miles from the Polish border. The audacity of that. Um, and then the fallout of the memes that have come out of this are hilarious. But you also have videos of guys saying like, "I'm getting out of here." There's one guy who was talking about how him and a Canadian, some British guys, and another American hitched the ride hiding inside an ambulance and were dropped off 5 kilometers from the border. And British special forces basically told them like, and the British special forces were part of some humanitarian corridor. Um, said if you have any kit, you're going back. They're not going to, because what they'll do is they'll cut up your passport and say you have to go back. Like the Ukrainians, they're not they're not Westerners. Like if you really believe all that shit-lib democracy nonsense about Ukrainians, like I mean, that's just they just do that to, in the way that other Eastern European countries do. They have to pretend that they're serious about that stuff to get funding, because it signals unity. More than anything else, it signals obedience. And I, that story was very revealing. And you see just a loss of morale. I mean, there was another post on 4chan, and it looked like it was originally on Reddit because it was screen capped. And it was talking about an American who was posting to Instagram, and he posted his location, and even like the other guys that he was with who were Ukrainian told him not to do that. And the story goes that the place got hit, something like 103 were killed. Um, I don't know if that's the same base that the one that we're talking about just west of Lviv. So it could be a different place. The way he described it, I'm not sure. So, and lots of other stories, you can see that there's a loss of morale, stories about them not having guns, or having guns with only 10 rounds. Things aren't really progressing as much as these guys. And these guys, this is the whole Redditor army that we laughed about a few weeks ago when they said they were joining the resistance and so on, right? Like they're I mean, some of them still persisted, and they're going to Kiev. And I saw one New York Times video, and this young guy Adam, who is American and Israeli, and he says that he's probably not going to fight, but he's going, if he has to, he will. But he'll be doing humanitarian work in Kiev. And I'm thinking, like, you are crazy. Like, you are not going to be doing humanitarian work. You're going to be a meat shield, right? Another post said they had a group of 10 fighters. 8 of them were killed, and 2 of them crawled their way out of the area that was being contested, and just hung on and stayed alive. So yeah, it's not what people kind of go back to what I was saying earlier. I know not everybody's familiar with Spengler and his philosophy of history, but religious components is that all youthful civilizations are religious. They are authentically religious. And this is why I bring up these religious elements, the cathedral, the pamphlets that they've been given, even the odd time, the kind of things that slip out in Putin's rhetoric. They're very rare. I don't want to overemphasize them. Where he mentions God and the fate of Russians. There's that speech that he gave 2-3 years ago where he said, "What if there's a nuclear war?" He says, "Well, the dogs will go to hell and we'll go to heaven." So I see this in conjunction with this new Cold War as the development of an environment that can nurture that. So, anyways, I just wanted to mention that.
Yes, I think you make a good point in regard to that. And again, I love the Spangler references, and I won't claim to be the most well read in the works of Spangler. I grapple with them, I'll put it that way, but certainly I would recommend to anyone in the audience who hasn't explored them to explore them. But speaking of Spangler and speaking of declines of civilization, I do want to discuss something that is, on the surface, a bit less of a serious story, but I think very telling about the state of Ukraine and of these American vassal states nonetheless. So, there have been several articles in the press regarding the fate of these babies that are to be adopted to Westerners in Ukraine not being able to be sent out of the country. And of course, Ukraine is one of the global hotspots for commercial surrogacy. Now, one may be listening to this and think, what the hell does that have to do with whatever we've discussed this previous episode and these past several episodes? And this is a point I've brought up before, where Ukraine is quite literally a child farm, and if you want to even use harsher terms, a hub of human trafficking. So, no surprise, a lot of these young children are sent west. A lot of them are sent to, let's just say, non traditional couples who aren't of,
Mm.
the heterosexual persuasion, as we'll put it. And that has been the big media push that these children are trapped in Ukraine. But what I do think this shows is, and you can also talk about the pornography industry in the Czech Republic and Hungary. You can talk about, again, the sex trafficking that was rampant all across Eastern Europe and is still has been addressed, but is still absurdly high today in many parts of Eastern Europe. But this is the consequence of being a vassal state of the American Empire. This is the consequence of having sold yourself to this global system. I will say that unequivocally. And this isn't necessarily a defense of Russia or the Soviet system or whatever. Again, I'm saying this in complete absence of Russia or the country that was once known as the Soviet Union in this analysis. That when you accept this as a second or third world country, you see this also in the Philippines and Thailand, Southeast Asia, these other hubs of the American Empire, where effectively one
America
of
just makes Weimar republics.
yes, that's where I'm ultimately getting at, and effectively on top of pillaging your country economically, they quite literally pillage the human capital of your country, and whether that is through more conventional means, such as bringing in millions of migrant workers from these poorer nations, whether that be, again, somewhere in the Middle East, somewhere in Latin America, or somewhere in Eastern Europe. I mean, I'm sure our European viewers know how many people from Poland or Ukraine or Hungary are there working in blue collar jobs or working as janitors or working as whatever. The so called jobs that, the native population won't do, the same treatment I imagine gets subjected to you over there as us that Americans hear about Hispanic migrant labor. But point being is it's you get drained of your human capital in hopes that they'll wire a little bit back home to support their families, and that those remittances will prop up the economy. I know in Latin America, I think
Mhm.
Mexico and a lot of the Central American states, speaking from an American perspective, a significant chunk of their economy is built on remittances from migrant workers in the United States. And I imagine many of those Eastern European countries that are part of the European Union are probably much the same way, where a significant chunk of their economy is remittance based. Now, maybe a more sizable one, such as Poland, which has more of its own legs to stand on. Not saying that Poland is this great independent power, but point being is, I would say, compared to, say, uh, the Czech Republic, and even though maybe that's not fair, Czech Republic is a bit wealthier, but say some of these Balkan states like Slovenia or Croatia, or even getting into Hungary or hell Ukraine itself, where a lot of it is built upon this. And really the only countries that have seen a increase in standard of living ever since the fall of the Eastern Bloc in the Soviet Union have been the Baltic states. To their credit, they have managed to pull themselves out of this, and a lot of the social ills that affect a lot of Eastern Europe also do seem to have passed the Baltic states for one reason or another. And again, there's many reasons you could speculate about that. But the point being is, the vast majority of the former Eastern Bloc and Soviet Union is governed this way, and this is what they were trying to turn Russia into in the 90s. And Ukraine is
Mhm.
also, I would say, most importantly to Russia, to Russia's narrative for the past several years, was that look at an alternative history. Was that look, what if we continued down the path of men like Yeltsin running this country? And maybe Putin isn't the greatest nationalist in the world. Maybe Putin isn't this a great
Oh,
visionary
who
who's going to
cares?
read civil. Exactly, that's what I'm getting at.
I
Point.
mean, who cares? No leader in the European world has given them so many tools to take back their country.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
if
that's
you ain't
that's
doing
that,
it and your church ain't doing it, and you've had all these doors open, then you don't deserve it.
yeah, that's exactly what
I'm just saying, like,
what I'm getting at. Like, to terms of, like, you can again throw out all these criticisms against Putin. You can have all these debates about Putin. What I'm asking you to do, if you feel that way, set all of those aside. But point being, it is indisputable, regardless of your opinion on the current state of Russia, if it were run by men like Yeltsin today, it would be
Mm,
a Ukraine of 140 million people. Now, probably even less than that because
absolutely.
emigration would be much higher. I'm not saying that Russia doesn't have an emigration problem. Most of Eastern Europe has an emigration problem. I mean, for example, just take a look at somewhere like Bulgaria, where these villages are just disappearing off the map because so many people are either moving into the cities or moving abroad. And I would say that's one of the most pertinent issues for these Eastern European countries to address, not only their birth rates but their emigration rates. They need to convince their people to actually live in their countries and not go abroad to the West, which does create that bit of a catch-22 when your economy does benefit so greatly from remittances from diaspora in the West. So it creates this whole cluster of a situation where there's really no clear answers. But point being is, I think Ukraine in particular serves a very important example to Russians that this is what they want for us, and this is very well what could have been, despite any issues we may have with our internal problems. And I would say that has actually been probably one of the biggest boons to the popularity of somebody like Putin. But just taking a look at that, I mean, perhaps it's just because the nature of it, perhaps just because it feels so unnatural, like this buying and selling of children. But I just think that Ukraine becoming what is effectively this child farm is really the epitome of the post Eastern Bloc, you know, Eastern Europe, these post Soviet Eastern European states, that this is the treatment they get for throwing off the shackles of their oppressors. And I think Poland is also been subjected to this sort of treatment, yet refused to learn their lesson, where Poland was given these praises in the 80s and the 90s for throwing off the shackles of its oppressors, Hungary as well, and and migrating towards the West. But the minute they took an illiberal direction, the minute they took an even more slightly nationalistic direction, it was an unending stream of condemnation and accostation and sanctions. And again, look at how Brussels has been treating Poland and Hungary for the past 4 years, to the point where, again, these are great states to be lauded when they're throwing off their previous rulers, but when we walk into the same trap, when we see that their defiant spirit just didn't dissipate over the past 30 years, they must be punished. Not to mention, these are also the countries on the front line of this so-called Russian menace that we have to keep in mind. And again, it just really shows the treatment, that the promises versus the reality for Eastern European countries who either pursued or want to pursue further integration into the West, into the American empire.
Yeah, it's I mean, I think there's countries in Eastern Europe that don't have I mean, their governments are different, but they don't have really a lot of ill feelings. Like uh some of them downright like them. So, the Greeks and the Serbs definitely like them. Serbs in Bosnia definitely. Bulgarians, Macedonians, quite okay. They like the Russians. Even Slovaks, ironically, sometimes like are quite pro-Russian or empathetic with the Russians, but they have to toe the line. I mean, Serbia doesn't have to, but even they have stopped flights to Moscow. I'm guessing it's the pressure that's being exerted on them. Um, yeah, I mean, it's still very early, but there's a whole new developing right now, and we are like the construction of the Berlin Wall. That's how significant I think this is. Um, what happens with the other countries is I think the economy sours more and more. I don't know. Uh, Generally, right now they're very strong. They're countries like India, Saudi Arabia, especially China, even Vietnam, tentatively, although it's been pressured by the U.S., tend to be sympathetic, and some of them, of course, as we said earlier, are changing the entire trading system because there is a new banking banking system that's coming. And Russia is going to back the ruble with gold. It has 5 mines. One of them is particularly big, and they will just dig up more gold. They have more gold than anyone. So um, it does look like they will weather this. The other thing I wanted to say about Russia was Putin's speech, where he condemned. He did make an effort to reach out to those people who are wealthy Russians living abroad to come back and say, we haven't seized anyone's assets. Of course, that doesn't mean like Boeing, who is, or Western banks who have seized Russian assets. Well, of course, Russia is going to seize those factories now. It's retaliation, but for investors, that's who was mostly interested in reaching. He had like a kind of a harsh but fair message. So he urged those people to come back and invest in Russia, as I have been telling you to, and you won't have to worry about your investments being seized, because all that, and everybody fell for it, including a certain podcast that went on and on about Abramovich. He's really close to Putin, because he won a court case against Borisovsky. Like, how do you know they're really that close? I mean, no one has any proof about that. I don't personally think they are, but in the speech he says, for those who want to live here, but your investments are elsewhere, your mind isn't here, implying like you're not really Russian, you know. And he says, you're scum, and you're not patriots, and we will spit you out. The average patriot in Russia will spit you out. And I find it interesting that this came like 3, 4 days after 10 planes of oligarchs landed in Israel. And these were not small little charter planes. These were large planes, from at least what the photo indicated in the newspaper article. And I'm assuming, their entire families are going. And it's not because I think their assets have been frozen or seized at the moment, but I think they expect the worst,
Yes,
right?
and a large part of the sanctions ever since
Meaning
2014.
they, sorry, I'm sorry, meaning like they are afraid to instigate a color revolution, mass protests, or whatever to take out Putin.
Yes, and
That to me is a clear sign that they're terrified.
you touched on what I was about to say, because the entire point of sanctions from 2014 onwards was the hope that the oligarchs would put pressure on Putin or try to, again, have him removed because of their personal bottom line suffering. And it seems that hadn't happened, and it seems like the cleaning of house that took place in the 2000s really did secure some degree of loyalty, or at least compliance, out of the Russian oligarchs. And it does look like at this point, when
Mhm.
push really comes to shove, they're more ready to leave than actually instigate internal change. They're willing to cut their losses and enjoy their wealth elsewhere, somewhere like Tel Aviv, which should tell you everything you need to know about them. But I suppose that point has been driven into the ground many times by many people. But that is all I had for today. If you have anything else.
No, that's all I've got.
So thank you everyone for tuning into this possibly disjointed episode of the War Report.
Yeah.
I'll see what I can do in post production about the whole stopping mid recording. Just note to self: when using OBS, simply do not hit the space bar when you're moving your keyboard on your desk. So if there is something like that, if there was something about the midway and the point in the show where it sort of glitched out, or if this is actually a part two, because I might upload these as two separate parts if I can't work it out in the editing. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the War Report. We will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Thank you, and take care.